He arrived in the third week of October, when the ash trees along the Ashcroft Drive had turned the color of old copper, and the puddles on the lane held a skin of cold that cracked under a boot heel like a pane of thin glass. The carriage Stowe had sent was a hired vehicle, not a house carriage, and Cecily Farwell noticed this from the upper landing window before she noticed anything else. Mr. Prolid. Stowe did not send hired vehicles to fetch people he considered worth impressing. Whatever this new tutor was, he was not expected to matter. She was at the front door before the housekeeper could reach it. Someone had to be. She opened it herself, and the man standing on the gravel looked at the house, before he looked at her. He stood quite still for a moment, his trunk at his feet, his gaze moving along the stone facade and across the east wing's windows, with an attention too slow and particular to be a first glance at an unfamiliar place. Then he looked at her. He was taller than she had expected, for a man described in the correspondence only as formerly of the King's Dragoons, and in possession of a reference from a colonel. He was broad through the shoulder in a way that suggested the coat had been purchased at some earlier and more prosperous moment. His hair was dark auburn and close-cropped, and there was a pale scar running along his left cheekbone, thin as a thread. His eyes were gray. They settled on her with the kind of quiet, total attention that she was not accustomed to receiving from anyone. "Mr. Hale," she said, "I am Miss Farwell. I manage the schoolroom arrangements here." "Miss Farwell," he said. His voice was level, without inflection. He did not ask who she was or what her position was or whether there was someone of greater consequence to whom he should present himself. He simply looked at the house again for a moment, then lifted his trunk. "I will show you to your rooms," she said. He did not answer. He followed her in. Garrick Stowe found him in the entrance hall and introduced himself with the particular species of condescension reserved for men who have recently acquired something they did not expect to keep. He was florid and thickening, and dressed well enough to remind everyone in the room that he could afford to dress well. He looked at the new tutor with the brief assessing glance of a man examining a piece of hired furniture. "You will take the boys in the north schoolroom," Stowe said. "Thomas is 10, Kit is 8. They are visiting for the winter from their mother's house in Shropshire, my nephew's boys. They want managing more than teaching, if I am plain about it." He turned to Portia, who had drifted into the hall with the unhurried motion of a young woman who had been beautiful since birth and had been told about it since shortly after. "He is a tutor, child, and nothing more. Do not waste your eyes." Portia looked at her father, then at the tutor, then at her nails. "I have not wasted anything," she said. Cecily watched the new man receive all of this without a change in his expression. He did not flush. He did not stiffen. He did not smile with the performance of a man pretending humiliation is nourishing. He simply waited until Stowe had finished, and then asked a single question about the boy's current progress in Latin. Stowe blinked, as if the question had arrived from an unexpected direction. "I am sure Miss Farwell can tell you," he said, and left the hall. Cecily told him. He listened without interrupting, and when she was finished, he asked 3 more questions, all specific and practical, none of them requiring her to perform any particular social face. When she answered the last one, there was a pause, and she had the strange sensation that he was deciding something. Then he picked up his trunk again. "Thank you," he said. "I will not trouble you further tonight." She watched him climb the stairs. His boots were worn at the heel. She did not think about him again until morning. The house that held them had a name older than anyone in it. Ashcroft Park had stood in this particular fold of the Shropshire Hills since the reign of the second George, and before the house there had been a lesser building, and before that a farmstead, and before that nothing but the land itself, which had always been the same land regardless of what the law called it, and who the law said owned it. Cecily's father, William Farwell, had managed Ashcroft Park for 31 years. He had walked every field and measured every stream and knew the name of every tenant family, from the Sayers at the north boundary to the Pugh family who kept the mill at the creek's bend. He had kept the estate's books in his own neat hand, and had taught Cecily to read them before he taught her to play the pianoforte. He had died the previous November, quietly, of a chest ailment that had been gathering for 3 winters. He had died believing that Edmund Ashcroft, the young Earl of Ashford, who had gone to the peninsula with his brother in 1812, was dead. Cecily was not entirely certain of that. Her father had kept his correspondence in a cedar box, with a brass latch, and she had gone through it after his death, with the careful attention of a daughter who understood what she was losing when she lost the only person who had ever regarded her competence as a simple fact, rather than a surprise. Most of the letters were what she expected. There were estate matters, tenants' petitions, the solicitor's quarterly reports, Stowe's instructions, which had become more numerous and more proprietary in tone as the years passed. Near the bottom of the box, she had found a letter dated June of 1813, written in an unfamiliar hand from a military hospital in Lisbon. It was addressed to her father. It said only that the writer had reason to believe that the Earl of Ashford had survived the action at the Douro crossing, though the extent of his injuries was not yet determined and his whereabouts were imprecise. The letter had no signature, only initials, T.A. She had read it twice and put it back in the box and not known what to do with it. She had no proof. She had no standing. She was a steward's daughter with a position that Stowe tolerated because she was useful. And if she produced an unsigned letter suggesting that the heir whose death declaration Stowe's solicitor had just filed in Chancery was in fact alive, Stowe would dismiss her before the week was out, and the letter would vanish with her. She knew this with the precise clarity of someone who had spent 3 years learning exactly how little weight her observations carried in Garrick Stowe's household. And so she had kept the letter in the cedar box, and locked the box and kept it under the second loose board beneath her bed, and she had not spoken of it to anyone, not even to Mrs. Peel, who kept the house's secrets with the same fidelity. She kept its linen. She had told herself that if proof of a different kind ever arrived, she would know what to do with it then. She had not expected proof to arrive in a hired carriage asking careful questions about Latin. The first week passed in the ordinary rhythm of a house settling into autumn. The new tutor took the boys in the schoolroom from 8 until 12, and from 2 until 4, and in the hours between he walked the grounds. This was what Cecily noticed first, because she walked the grounds herself, and she kept encountering him where she did not expect to. He moved with direction and purpose, looking at things with the same particular attention he had given the house on the afternoon of his arrival. He looked at the ha-ha wall along the south lawn, which had a section of collapsed stone that Stowe's estate manager, Mr. Vane, had been promising to repair for 2 years. He looked at the drainage channel behind the home farm, which flooded every spring and ruined the lower pasture because the original cut had silted at the bend. He looked at the kitchen garden wall, which Cecily had been patching herself with salvaged stone, because Vane would not authorize the labor. She watched him, in the careful sideways manner she had learned in this house, and filed what she saw in the same quiet place she kept everything she was not yet ready to speak aloud. On the 4th morning he came to the schoolroom door while she was inside with the 2 boys before his lesson, and he said simply, "Miss Farwell, there is a crack along the north window-sill that will admit cold air by December. Paris. I thought you would want to know." She looked at him. "I know," she said. "I have been requesting its repair since August." He looked at her for a moment. Would it help if the request came from me? She felt something shift inside her chest, small and precise. "It might," she said. He nodded and left. By the following afternoon, Vane had sent a carpenter. She did not know what to make of him. If she had been asked to describe the feeling, she would have said that it resembled standing in a room where all the furniture had been moved slightly to the left. Everything was recognizable and nothing was quite right, and she kept reaching for things that were not precisely where she had expected to find them. He appeared at the edges of her days, asked practical questions, listened to the answers, and occasionally did something with what she told him, as the carpenter demonstrated. She found herself telling him things she had not planned to tell anyone. He found her in the kitchen garden one morning in the 2nd week, cutting the last of the autumn herbs for Mrs. Peel. She had not heard him cross the gravel. She was aware of him before she saw him, some animal registration of a presence nearby, and she turned to find him standing at the gate with a look on his face that she could not immediately catalogue. Not approval. Precisely. Something quieter and more considered than approval. "Your gloves are soaked," he said. "They are." She set down the cutting basket and looked at her hands. The leather had darkened through entirely. "I forgot to replace them." He stepped inside the gate and picked up the basket. He did not hand it back to her. He held it with the matter-of-fact quality of a man who had decided to carry something and was not going to explain why. They walked toward the kitchen door together without having agreed to do so. "The garden wall," he said after a moment. "I patched the east section last month," she said. "The north section will need a proper mason. I know." She glanced at him sideways. "You have been looking at it." "I have been looking at a great many things," he said, and something in the weight of the sentence made her look at him directly, which she had not quite managed until then. His gray eyes were steady on the path ahead. The scar along his cheekbone caught the flat autumn light. She looked away again. "You look at this place," she said carefully, "as though you are trying to memorize it." He was silent for long enough that she thought he would not answer. Then he said, "Something like that." She felt the flutter of some near knowledge in her chest, and she held very still and let it settle and did not pursue it. Her heart knew something that her mind was not yet prepared to articulate, and she had learned, in this house, that the things one articulated too quickly were the things one lost. She did not think of the letter under the loose board. She did not allow herself to think of it. The scene at the estate office happened on a Thursday, in the hour before supper, when the house was briefly between its daytime and evening selves. Cecily had gone to see Vane after Mrs. Peel brought troubling news. 3 tenant families had not received their quarterly payments. The Sayers, the Pavs at the mill, and a young widow named Mrs. Holt, who farmed 4 acres near the stream. The quarter day was 8 days past. Vane received her with the particular combination of irritation and dismissal he reserved for conversations he felt were beneath his station to have. He was a compact man, with a neat beard and small eyes, and he did not appreciate being questioned by a woman who had no formal authority over estate management, which he never failed to imply. "The disbursements are under review," he said. "Under review," Cecily repeated. "By whom?" "By me," he said. "And by Mr. Stowe." "For what purpose?" "That is not your concern, Miss Farwell." She placed her hands flat on the desk. She felt her pulse in her throat, and she steadied it. "The Paps have not been paid since the summer. Mrs. Holt has 2 children and a mother to feed. If the quarterly disbursement is not made by Friday, I will write to Mr. Finch directly, and ask whether this is consistent with the terms of the trustee arrangement." Vane looked at her with the expression of a man recalculating something. "You would not?" he said. "I have the address," she said, "and I can write." She placed her father's brass compass on the desk between them while she spoke, a thing she did not consciously decide to do. It was simply that she needed something solid under her hand, something that had belonged to a man who had walked this land for 30 years and known its obligations, and the compass was the most solid thing she owned. It sat on the ledger, its engraved lid glinting in the lamplight. The ledger came out of the drawer within 5 minutes. The entries were corrected. She picked up the compass and left. She did not know that he had been in the corridor. She did not know that he had seen the compass or that he had stood with his hand pressed flat against the wall for the duration of the exchange, or that when she left he looked at the closed door with an expression she would never see and could not have named. What she knew was that on Friday, the Sayers and the Paffs and Mrs. R. Holt received their payments, and that on Saturday morning the new tutor said, over the breakfast table, "Well done, Miss Farwell," and then returned to the newspaper as though he had not said it. And Cecily sat very still and felt something warm move through her that she deliberately did not examine. That evening, she thought, was when everything changed, though she could not have said what changed or in which direction. He found her in the library at the end of the second week. She was returning a volume she had borrowed, a study of agricultural drainage that had been her father's. and that she had taken down to look up the specifications for the South Meadow problem. She had not expected anyone to be there. The room was lit only by the fire, and one lamp on the reading table, and he was standing at the window with his back to her, looking out at the dark grounds. She put the book on the shelf. She would have left without speaking, but he turned. Miss Farwell. He looked at the book in her hand, the spine facing her. Agricultural drainage. The South Meadow floods every spring, she said. The original cut, silted at the bend. She paused. My father identified the problem in 1811. It was never corrected. Something shifted in his face. Not the usual careful blankness, something that arrived and was suppressed before she could read it properly. He looked out the window again. He worked here a long time, Edmund said. Your father 31 years, she said. He knew every field and every family. She stopped, because her voice had done something she had not authorized it to do, and she steadied herself. He died believing the estate had a future, that whoever held it eventually would manage it as it deserved. He was very still at the window. The firelight caught the scar along his cheek. She could see his jaw working. The slight tension of a man holding something in. Did he? Edmund said. It was not quite a question. He did, she said. Though the last year was difficult, when the death declaration was filed. He understood what it meant. He said nothing to me directly. I found his journals after he died, and the last entry, written 3 days before he passed, was simply a list of the families on the estate. Their names, their acreages, the names of the children. As though he was giving them to someone who might not know. The silence in the library was absolute save for the fire. He had turned from the window and was looking at her with the gray eyes that never quite left a thing they had decided to look at. He sounds, Edmund said, like a man who understood what stewardship meant. He was, she said. Everything I know about it, I know from him. He crossed the room then, not toward her, but toward the bookshelf, and he took down a volume she did not recognize and held it for a moment without opening it. She saw his hands clearly for the first time. They were large and capable, the left one bearing a stippled scar across the knuckles that looked old, the kind left by gravel or stone at speed. My brother, he said without turning. The words arrived as though they had been waiting a long time to be released. His name was Thomas. He was 22 when he died. He enlisted because he thought it would be like the stories I used to tell. The cavalry, the campaigns. The sense that a man could be useful in a way that ordinary peacetime life did not quite permit. He stopped. The volume in his hands was very still. He died of fever outside Salamanca. He was not shot. He was not killed in action. He died in a tent, with a fever that lasted 6 days, and I was in a field hospital on the other side of the ridge and could not reach him. She did not move. She understood that movement would break something. I told the stories, he said. I made it sound like what a young man ought to want. I was 28 and certain of a great many things, and I convinced him. He put the book back on the shelf with care as if it were fragile. I have not been certain of very many things since. She stood in the silence and let him have it. She did not offer comfort, and she did not offer contradiction, and she did not say the things that people said, the things that arrived already shaped and smooth from too much use. She simply remained in the room with him, and after a long moment, he turned, and his eyes went to the pocket of her apron, where the compass made a small square shape against the wool. Where did you get that? He said. His voice was entirely different, quiet and very precise. She looked down at her apron, and then back at him. My father's. It was a gift from the old Earl, the one before. Edmund's father gave it to my father. He gave it to my father the year the north fences were rebuilt. They had apparently spent a month mapping the boundary lines together, and the compass had been used in the survey. She touched the outline of it through the cloth. He carried it every day for 30 years. I carry it now. He looked at her for a very long moment. Then he said, in the level voice that she had come to understand, meant he was holding something at some cost. It is a fine thing to be carried. She did not sleep well that night. The air in the house changed after that. Though she could not have said when exactly the change became perceptible, he was on the surface exactly what he had always been. Methodical, contained, present at the edges of her days. The boys adored him with the uncomplicated fidelity of children who recognize when an adult is actually paying attention to them. The boy named Thomas, the elder of the two nephews, had taken to following him through the grounds after lessons as though by gravitational pull, and Cecily watched Edmund with the child, and saw on his face something that was not quite grief and not quite tenderness, but occupied the space where both lived. One afternoon she came upon them at the boundary wall near the north field. Edmund had the boy up on the stone top, steadying him with one hand, while Thomas looked out across the upper pastures with a child's sovereign gaze. Edmund was pointing at something in the middle distance, explaining something she could not hear, and the expression on his face was the least guarded she had seen it. She turned away before he could see her looking. The practical work of wanting someone, while knowing you had no standing to want them, was, she had discovered, nearly identical to the practical work of managing an estate that was not yours. You learned the contours of the thing precisely because you were never going to own it. That precision of knowledge was itself a form of grief. You did not name grief, because naming it would cost you the only part that was still bearable, which was the nearness. She did not name it. She kept the compass in her apron pocket, and she walked the grounds, and she managed the household, and she watched him carry the weight of something she was beginning to understand was much heavier than a brother's death, and she waited for the thing she could not quite see to arrive. It arrived on a Tuesday, in the form of Mr. Finch. The solicitor came up from Shrewsbury in his own gig, which meant his visit was not expected to last the night. He spent 2 hours in Stowe's study, with the door shut, and when he came out, his expression had the slightly elevated quality of a man who has confirmed something he already knew. Stowe came out behind him with a flushed complexion and a new kind of confidence, the kind that settles on a man when a problem has just been lifted from him by official means. Cecily was in the hall when they emerged. Finch looked at her with a brief assessing glance that did not find her significant, and looked away again. "The filing is complete," Stowe said, to no one in particular, which meant to everyone. "Chancery has received the declaration. The estate status is formalized." She understood what that meant. She had understood what it would mean since she had first read the language in the correspondence. The Earl was declared legally dead. The estate passed out of trust. Stowe was no longer a trustee, he was simply the holder, with full latitude to dispose of the property as he chose. She went to her room and sat on the bed and put her hand on the cedar box, beneath the loose board, and did not open it. At supper that evening, Stowe was in better spirits than she had seen in months. He had wine brought from the good cellar. Portia wore a new dress. The filing, it seemed, called for celebration. It was Portia who supplied the third voicing, in the conversational register of a young woman who has been bored for several weeks and has identified a target. She was speaking to her cousin Harriet, who had arrived that afternoon for the supper, and she spoke at a volume that carried. "He is a tutor, and nothing more," Portia said, cutting her fish without looking up. "He eats at the family table by my father's indulgence. One does not trouble oneself about tutors." Edmund sat 3 chairs down the table. He did not react. He ate with the careful economy of a man who has eaten many meals in circumstances that did not invite comment, and his eyes, when they moved to Cecily, and in them she saw something she did not understand. Not humiliation. Not anger. Something that looked improbably like apology. She did not understand the apology. Not yet. After supper, in the corridor outside the drawing room, Stowe stopped her. He looked at her with the assessing satisfaction of a man who had just won something and was still enjoying the quality of the winning. "I will be selling the park," he said, "in the spring private treaty. I have had interest from Lord Pinner for the west acreage, and a man from Bristol for the house itself. The family will remove to Portia's establishment in Bath by Easter." She stood in the corridor and kept her face still. "And the tenants," she said. The new owner can determine what he likes, Stowe said. That will not be my concern. He left her in the corridor. She stood there for some time after he had gone. Then she went to her room and put on her heaviest cloak and went out through the kitchen door into the cold. She found Edmund in the lane. He was standing beside a trunk that had been set on the gravel, and the hired carriage was waiting at the end of the drive, with its lamps lit against the dark. The rain had begun, thin and cold, and his coat was already wet across the shoulders. He had his hat in his hand. He looked at her when she came around the corner of the garden wall, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "He dismissed you," she said. "This afternoon," he said, "while you were with the boys." She looked at the trunk. She looked at him. The rain was falling on his bare head and on the brass lantern of the waiting carriage and on the gravel of the lane that her father had helped lay 20 years ago, with stone brought from the quarry at the ridge's far edge. "He is selling it," she said in the spring. "I know," he said. She put her hand in her apron pocket and closed her fingers around the compass. She had made a decision somewhere between the corridor and this lane. Not the decision she had expected to make, but a different one, smaller and more irreversible. She held the compass out to him. He looked at it in her hand. He did not take it immediately. "My father carried it for 30 years because he loved what it was used to measure," she said. Her voice was steady. She had practiced steadiness for a long time, and it served her now. He spent his life knowing where the boundaries of this place were and making sure they were honored. "If you are leaving, I want you to have it. I do not know why precisely. Only that you looked at this land the way he looked at it. And I think that is a kind of knowing that should not go unrewarded." He looked at the compass in her palm. Then he looked at her face. The rain was coming harder now, and she could feel it on her hair, cold and steady. "The estate had a steward," she said, "who died believing it was still worth saving. I think he was right. I cannot do anything about it. I want someone to know that he was right." Edmund reached out and took the compass from her hand. His fingers closed over it and over her fingers for a single moment, warm against the cold, and then he stepped back. "Miss Farwell," he said. And the way he said her name was different from how he had ever said it before, weighted in a way she did not have the context to read. "I will not be gone long." She watched the carriage take him down the lane in the dark and the rain, and she stood in the wet until its lamps had disappeared around the curve of the drive. And then she went inside. She did not sleep that night either. This time, the wakefulness had a different quality. Not grief, though grief was in it. Something that kept her looking at the dark ceiling with the precise alertness of someone waiting for a sound they cannot quite identify but are certain is coming. He came back in the morning, not in a hired carriage. In a post-chaise with a crown seal on the door and a uniformed king's messenger beside it. And 2 men she did not recognize riding behind on good horses. She was at the window of the schoolroom when they came up the drive, and she stood with her hand on the cold glass and watched Edmund step down from the post-chaise. He was wearing different clothes, not the tutor's worn coat. A navy-fitted tailcoat, precisely cut, with a high collar and a white cravat and light breeches, and boots that had been polished to a finish that caught the flat morning light. He wore them the way a man wears what he is supposed to wear, and she understood in that moment, in a physical descent through her chest, what she had been slowly understanding for 3 weeks. She was downstairs before she had decided to be. The scene in Stowe's drawing room was not loud. That was the first thing she registered when she arrived at the door, which stood open. The room was entirely quiet, the kind of quiet that occupies a space from which all ordinary sound has been removed. Stowe was standing near the mantel. Finch was seated. Both were looking at Edmund. The king's messenger stood near the door with a leather satchel and an expression of official patience. Mrs. Peel was there, which surprised Cecily, and then she understood that Mrs. Peel had been told to be there, or had made her own decision about it, which amounted to the same thing. Edmund held the document. He was reading it aloud in the level, unhurried voice she knew. But the voice had something underneath it now that had not been there before, a quality of authority so complete, it did not need to assert itself. He looked up and saw her in the doorway. "Miss Farwell," he said, "you should hear this." She stepped inside. The document was from the War Office. It attested to the identity and survival of Edmund James Ashcroft, Earl of Ashford, late of the 4th Regiment of Light Dragoons, wounded at the Douro crossing in May of 1812 and recovering at a military hospital in Lisbon until June of 1813, returned to England in September of 1814. Attached were a letter from his former commanding officer and the signatures of 2 officers who had served with him and were prepared to testify. Finch's pen had been in his hand. It was no longer in his hand. Stowe said something. She heard the words, but they did not hold their shape against the quality of the morning. His complexion had gone from florid to a particular shade of dull gray that she associated with men who have been keeping a thing alive through will alone and have just been informed the will is not sufficient. Edmund set the document on the table and looked at Stowe. "I am Edmund Ashcroft," he said, "and this is my land." 10 words, without theater, without anger. The weight of them was geological rather than dramatic, something that had been accumulating for a long time and had simply arrived. Stowe sat down. He did not do this deliberately. His legs simply made the decision for him. He sat in the chair nearest to him, and his hands lay open on his knees, and he looked at him across the drawing room of the house where he had been comfortable for 3 years, and found that the room had become a foreign country. The death declaration, Finch said, and the sentence did not finish itself. "Will be challenged in Chancery by Colonel Drayton's testimony before the week is out," Edmund said in the same level register. "I have no interest in prosecuting fraud unless it is contested. If you choose to contest it, that choice is yours." Mrs. Peel, at the edge of the room, let out a sound that was not quite a breath and not quite a word. She put her hand over her mouth and looked at the ceiling, and composed herself with the dignity of a woman who has kept this house's linen and secrets for 20 years. Portia was in the doorway behind Cecily. She had not been told to come, but she had come, because the quality of the morning had made itself felt through the walls of the house. She looked at Edmund with an expression that was not quite recognition, and not quite remorse, but was in the family of both. She said nothing. She stepped back from the doorway. Edmund looked at Cecily. He reached into his coat pocket and held out her father's compass. She crossed the room. She took it, his fingers again briefly. Over hers, and this time neither of them stepped back. "Your father's letter," she said very quietly. "The TA in June of 1813. It was your brother, was it not? Thomas Ashcroft? He had not yet died when he wrote it. He found your name on a casualty list with a question mark beside it, and wrote to your father's steward because he did not know who else to trust." Edmund looked at her. The gray eyes were completely open. No careful distance, no managed surface. Just him. "I did not know he had written," he said. "I did not know the letter existed until you described it to me in the library." She understood then that the evening in the library had not been incidental, that his telling her about Thomas had not been coincidence, that he had been giving her what he had of himself and asking, without asking, whether she would know what it was worth. "What will you do with it?" she said. "The estate." He was quiet for a moment. The morning light came through the drawing-room windows and lay across the carpet in pale rectangles, November light, stripped of warmth, but absolutely clear. "Repair the south meadow drainage first," he said. "Then the ha-ha wall. Then the kitchen garden." He paused. "I will need someone who knows the land and the families, who the Sayers are, and where the Paff's mill sits, and what Mrs. Holt at the stream requires to see her children through the winter." She looked at him. "That is a great deal of knowledge to need." "All at once," she said. "It is," he said. "I have been without it for 3 years. I should like not to be without it any longer." The drawing-room was very still. Stowe had not moved. Mrs. Peel had lowered her hand from her mouth. Outside through the window the ash trees stood in their late October copper against the gray Shropshire sky. "Cecily," Edmund said. And it was the first time, and it was not an accident, and she felt it in the way one feels the first warm day after a long winter, not as surprise but as a restoration of something the body had always known was owed. She did not answer right away. She looked at him for a long moment, the way you look at a landscape when you are trying to memorize it, and she thought of her father's journals and the list of names and the years that had made the estate what it was. And she thought of the compass she held in her hand which had measured these boundaries once before and could measure them again. The South Meadow, she said, will need 2 men for a week's digging, and a redirect of the channel at the bend. I know the survey, from my father's notes. Something moved, in his face, careful and certain. Good, he said. Then we will start there. If you have stayed with Cecily this far, leave a word for her in the comments. She carried something true across a very long winter. By December, the South Meadow drainage was corrected. The first frost arriving the same week, the new cut was finished, as if the land itself had been waiting for someone to pay attention. Edmund worked alongside the 2 men he hired from the village, which caused a certain amount of commentary among the household staff that Mrs. Peel declined to suppress. She had kept this house's secrets for 20 years, and could tell the difference between a secret and something that had not yet been properly witnessed. The drawing room had been reorganized. Stowe and Portia had removed to Bath before the month was out. Not because they were compelled to leave immediately, but because Stowe understood, with the practical intelligence of a man who had survived, by knowing when a position was untenable, that there was nothing left to hold. He shook Edmund's hand at the door with the stiff dignity of a man shaking hands with his own conscience. Portia looked, at the last moment, at Cecily, with an expression that contained more than she expected. Then she climbed into the carriage, and it was gone. The house was quieter without them. It was a different quality of quiet from before, not the suppressed quiet of a household holding its breath under an uncertain authority, but the quiet of a place that had settled back into itself, the way water settles after a stone has been removed. Edmund worked at the estate books every morning, in the study that had been his father's. He had asked Cecily to sit with him the first week, to supply what she knew of the tenants' arrangements and the outstanding matters that Stowe's management had allowed to drift. She had brought her father's ledger copies, which she had kept in the cedar box alongside the letter, and they had sat across the desk from each other in the cold morning light and worked through 3 years of accounts with the careful attention of 2 people who took this kind of work seriously. On the 3rd morning, he had looked up from the ledger and said, "You saved the mill's lease. I see the notation here in a different hand. This is not Vane's writing, my father's hand." He corrected the entry in the month before he died. He said the Paps had been on that land for 40 years, and their lease was being undercharged. He corrected it upwards so no one could claim they were behind. He looked at the ledger, and then at her. He did not say anything. Something in his face had the quality of a man coming to a decision that had been forming for some time. Thomas and Kit were collected by their mother in the 2nd week of November. At their departure, Thomas presented Edmund with a pencil drawing he had made of the north field from the top of the boundary wall. Edmund thanked the boy in a way that suggested the gift was being received as something actual, which Thomas understood, and which made him stand very straight as he climbed into the carriage. The letter from Chancery arrived in the 4th week of November. The death declaration had been rescinded on the testimony of Colonel Drayton and 2 officers in the War Office's certification of identity. Mr. Finch had not contested it. He had sent a letter of apology in the strained register of a man managing his exposure, and Edmund had read it once and set it aside. The evening after the Chancery letter arrived, he found Cecily in the library again. She was at the window, as he had been the first time, and she heard him come in and did not turn immediately. "It is settled," he said. "I know," she said. "Mrs. Peel told me." "She tends to," he said. There was something in his voice that was new, and she turned to look at it. The slight, careful tension in his jaw had released. He looked for the first time like a man who was not holding anything back from the room he was standing in. He crossed the room and stood beside her at the window. The grounds were dark outside, the ha-ha wall invisible in the shadow of the south lawn, but they both knew where it was. "I owe you an account," he said, "of why I came as I did, and what I intended, and what changed." "You do not owe me anything," she said. "I think I do." He was looking at the dark window. I came to assess what had been done to the estate, and to gather what evidence I could before presenting myself. I intended to be gone within 2 weeks. I had no intention of becoming attached to anything that was not brick and stone and ledger. She looked at his reflection in the dark glass. And I met you, he said simply. He turned to look at her, not the reflection. You were managing this house, and these grounds and these people with the precision and the care of someone who had given the best of herself to something she knew she might lose, and you never once suggested to me or to anyone that you deserved more credit for it than you received. And I watched you put your compass on Vane's desk, and I understood that you were using your father as your anchor, and that your father had been a man who deserved to be used that way. And I thought, he stopped. He looked at his hands. You thought, she said. I thought that I had spent 3 years believing I had lost the right to want anything that was not reparation, he said. And I found that I wanted something that was not reparation, and I did not know what to do with that. She looked at him in the firelight. The scar along his cheekbone, the gray eyes that had always looked at her as though looking, were itself a form of honoring. You could have told me, she said. I know, he said. I was afraid that if I told you who I was, you would look at me differently. I would have, she said. I do. She paused. It is not a worse looking. He reached out then, and his hand came to her face, not with the imperative quality she might have expected, but with something tentative and deliberate, as if he were asking a question and waiting for the answer before proceeding. She felt the warmth of his palm against her cheek, the roughness of the scar tissue on his knuckles, and she reached up and put her hand over his hand and held it there. The estate needs a countess, he said quietly. The estate needs its drainage corrected and its kitchen garden wall rebuilt, and its tenants paid on time, she said. The rest is secondary, he almost smiled. She saw it happen, the slight easing of the corner of his mouth, and it was as she had always suspected it would be, something to witness. Cecily, he said. Yes, she said, before he could ask it differently. She had known since the Lane in the Rain that she would say yes, and she had grown tired of waiting. The fire was behind them, and the dark grounds were before them, and somewhere in the south meadow the corrected drainage channel was carrying water toward the creek in the manner it had always been meant to carry it, and everything that was supposed to be where it was supposed to be was finally. They stayed at the window for a long time without speaking. The ha-ha wall was invisible in the dark, but they both knew its exact position. The collapsed section still waiting for its mason, the rest of it sound and present having held its ground against the years without anyone to notice or to thank it for doing so. In the spring, when the south meadow did not flood for the first time in 9 years, Mrs. Buddy Peel told the story to the new kitchen girl with the careful satisfaction of a woman reporting a fact rather than a wonder, because she understood that the difference between facts and wonders was mostly a matter of how long one had been waiting for them. The girl listened wide-eyed, and Mrs. Peel handed her a pile of linens to fold. Edmund had the kitchen garden wall rebuilt in March, and the mason was the son of one of the families Cecily had insured were paid their quarter's wages. The mason worked with the unhurried competence of a man who understood stone, and Edmund stood and watched him for a morning, the way he watched all the estate's work, with the attention of someone who intended to be here long enough to see the finish. Cecily stood beside him in the spring cold with her father's compass in her hand and Edmund's compass in her other hand. Both of them opened, both of them pointing the same direction, the land stretching away from them in the pale March light, the ash trees still bare but holding in their branches the small, tight buds of what was coming. Thomas Ashcroft wrote that letter from the hospital in Lisbon, she said. He was trying to find someone who would tell you that you were not on the casualty list after all. He wanted you to know that someone had looked, and you were still here. Edmund was quiet for a moment. Then he put his hand over both of her hands and the 2 compasses together, and he held them there. He found the right person, he said. She looked out across the land that was hers now, in the way that things are yours, when you know them completely, and tend to them faithfully, and will not leave them, the fields and the wall and the mill and the stream, and the families at their winter work, all of it known to her by name, all of it real. The morning held still around them as mornings do when something long unsettled has come to rest at last. If Cecily's steady keeping moved you, thank you for staying to the end. Leave her a word in the comments. She deserved to be seen.